greetings everyone. It's great to be with you here at Virtual General Conference. I hope you're enjoying the sessions and some of the great content that has been offered by my colleagues and other ministers in our fellowship. It's just great to be with you today, and I pray God's blessings over all of you wherever you are currently. I am approaching this session very humbly, knowing that while I may be a lover of history, I am not the authoritative oneness Pentecostal musical historian. But my fascination with our shared musical heritage does go back a long ways. My grandmother, June Demas, played cello in a large orchestra in W.T. Witherspoon's church on Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio. In fact, for many years, the photo of this impressive orchestra hung in the halls of the church that is now pastored by Brother Stark. And I was always just so fascinated by what I saw there, the legacy, the richness of instruments, the way God was allowing music to be used so beautifully in that church. And that was years and years ago. So my love of history goes back a long ways. For my master's degree, I wrote about a Pentecostal hymn book that was published in 1907. Of course, your brain is probably thinking like mine. 1907 Pentecostal? Yes, it was a book that was written actually by a non-denominational music publisher in a time when Pentecost was really more of a pursuit and a hunger and a desire and kind of a buzzword rather than a title of a denomination. And that's what caught my attention because, of course, we know that our Pentecostal denominations were not yet formed in 1907. And so for my master's program, I wrote a thesis on that book and just what it meant and what it brought to the surface about what Pentecost and the origins of Pentecostal music really were. So I've been at this a long time. And I am a bit of a history geek, I have to admit and confess. So I'm honored today to be talking to you about this topic. I think there's just so much to explore with regard to musical legacy in our fellowship. I'm personally fascinated by stories that there were attempts to recruit Jean Urshan as an artist by secular producers who were really drawn to her sound and kind of the Etta James quality in her voice. I want to hear more of these stories. I want these to become part of our written legacy. I wish I'd had a conversation with Dottie Rambo before her death. I would love to just have an honest and open conversation with her about the period of time where she may have felt a little bit pushed out of our fellowship because of doors that were opening to her to minister in denominational churches. I just love history. I still want to sit down with Nancy Granquist. She is with us, very much alive and with us. And I want to talk to her about similar moments in her musical career where she was fed the temptation to sell out to mainstream Christian labels, but instead chose to stay true to her oneness Pentecostal identity. I love stories like this, and I think we need to do a better job documenting and gathering the tales of those who've gone before us. I hope that we do better at this moving forward. We're a relatively new organization, of course. Here we are celebrating 75 years together, but we already have created a lot of rich history together, and we need to preserve the history that we have established. I've been asked to respond to a few questions here today, and the first question is this: do oneness Pentecostals have a distinct musical heritage? I think there's a fairly straightforward answer, and my answer is no. But I have reasons and documentation for my strong, resounding no. Let's start by looking at some of our own hymn books. In 1978, a committee of UPC leaders were tasked with creating a collection of hymns, gospel songs, and choruses. The men on the song selection committee were Hugh Rose, Merle Ewing, Robert Gilstrap, Wendell Gleason, and David Schroeder. And of course, you know the results. It's our own well-loved Sing Unto the Lord. And I have several copies of this. This one happens to be my home piano bench copy that is very marked up and falling apart. But Sing Unto the Lord, you guys know this book well. But prior to 1978, when our own organization created a collection of songs to become sort of our canon, our collection of shared repertoire, There was another hymn book that was widely used across our fellowship, and it was this one. This is Melodies of Praise. Some of y'all may recognize this book. And Melodies of Praise was actually created in 1957 by Gospel Publishing, which was, of course, the Assemblies of God publishing house. So here we have two books compiled over 20 years apart from one another. The first one being represented by the Assemblies of God, of course, a Trinitarian Pentecostal organization. The second one, our own Sing Unto the Lord. So out of curiosity, I compared Sing Unto the Lord to Melodies of Praise. These are the geeky things that people who do love history sit around and do. Here's what's interesting. The two books are remarkably similar. Sing Unto the Lord utilizes at least 173 songs that had been published also in Melodies of Praise. Now, I don't totally stand behind 173. I counted personally myself by cross-referencing, looking back and forth between the two books, so hopefully my numbers are right. But 173 is the number I came up with. With 401 total songs in Sing Unto the Lord collection, that means that 43% of our hymn book is identical to the Assemblies of God hymn book that had been published 21 years prior. If you look at what our own song selection committee members did, they did try to add in a few more Oneness Pentecostal writers. These included 7 songs by G.T. Haywood, including Thank God for the Blood, included Waterway by Hattie Pryor. Of course, that's There Shall Be Light in the Evening Time. A lot of you may not know the title, but you know the song. There was another song included by Hattie Pryor and Bishop R.C. Lawson. His name shall be praised. His name shall be praised. His name shall be praised. You guys might know that one. That they, of course, represent a Oneness Pentecostal organization other than the UPC, but very much Oneness Pentecostals. 2 songs by A.D. Urshan were included. 1 song by W.C. Parkey. All in Him, the well-loved declaration of the fullness of the Godhead, written by George Farrell, was included. And of course, those were all things that were not in the Assemblies of God hymn book. 8 songs by Lanny Wolfe were included. 4 songs by Dottie Rambo. 3 songs by Joan Ewing. 1 by a young artist in the 70s who was gaining popularity, our own dear Nancy Granquist. And then 2 songs by a well-loved music evangelist at the time in our fellowship, Jimmy Pierce. One of them was a very well-loved and performed duet called It's My Desire. And then another one of Jimmy Pierce's songs was also included. So, when you break it down, there were about 30 or more songs that were uniquely oneness added to the bulk of repertoire that came from non-oneness sources. So that means that, even if I've missed a few in my scan, maybe there's some Oneness Pentecostal writers in there that I just don't recognize the name. It means that only 10% of our own hymn book, this book right here, Sing Unto the Lord, 10% represents Oneness writers. This means that much of our musical heritage is a shared heritage. We draw what we think of as our hymn legacy from writers like Fanny Crosby and William Kirkpatrick, who wrote gospel songs for camp meetings and brush arbors back in the early 20th century. Then if you move a little forward in time, we draw a lot of our legacy from well-loved chorus writers, people like Bill Gaither and Audrey Meyer, both of whom have repertoire in Sing Unto the Lord hymn book. The strong gospel flavor that runs through so much of our music comes from a shared musical legacy that grew out of other Pentecostal and even non-Pentecostal environments. So our musical heritage is definitely a shared heritage. We do not by any means claim to only force feed Oneness Apostolic writers to our churches. We draw from a rich and broad musical heritage that is a shared heritage by other denominations and by other Pentecostal organizations. A second question that I was asked to address is to respond to this question: what artists or trends have defined worship in our congregation? Now, although Sing Unto the Lord is now over 40 years old, I think it reveals some important trends that have continued to define our fellowship. The first trend that I see is that we have been heavily influenced by Southern Gospel. Rusty Goodman, Ben Spear, John Sumner, and even Johnny Cash are all writers that are present in our Sing Unto the Lord hymn book. Don Sumner was a very well-known Nashville musician and writer who seems to have had incredible influence on Sing Unto the Lord. There are several anonymous written songs, choruses that were sort of part of popular tradition that were arranged by Don Sumner in Sing Unto the Lord. And then there were multiple of his songs that kind of slipped into the book. Most of them were written in 77 and 78, which means they were brand new songs that hadn't even had time to sort of develop a buzz in our churches, and yet our song selection committee chose to put those songs in the book. So definitely we were influenced by Southern Gospel, and I think this musical influence has continued to this day. We have a strong Southern Gospel influence in our churches. Many churches, I think we would say, strongly lean to Southern Gospel. Not all, and maybe we could say increasingly less and less, but it's definitely an influence. The second trend that I would say is something that I also saw in our hymn book, even back in 1978 when our Sing Unto the Lord book was compiled. Sing Unto the Lord really gives us a hint for the incredible love for choruses that would sweep across our fellowship. The simple, repetitive nature of worship choruses has facilitated many, many powerful moves of God in our churches. Although every church didn't follow this trend, that was strongly defined by groups like Maranatha and the Praise series. If you don't know about that, it's a thing, and it's something you should check out. You probably know more about that trend than you think you do. Songs like "We Exalt Thee" come out of that Maranatha trend. "As the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longeth after thee." That song, there's many, many songs that were written by those team of worship chorus writers, and they really influenced our churches. Worship leaders such as Bobby Shoemake early on recognized the power of these simple songs that allowed people to enter into God's presence and engage in pure, undistracted worship. Choruses were a really strong contrast to the wordiness of the gospel song. You know, when you think about the fact that, like, "Oh, I Want to See Him" has 4 verses and "We Exalt Thee" has 5 words, you realize that those two stand in very strong contrast with each other. Choruses were a great choice for many different environments. People who were working with a lot of new believers and new converts realized that the simplicity of these songs was very attainable by the new convert. Choruses were also a great choice for missionaries to translate into foreign languages. I saw this in our own international church growing up in Athens, Greece, in the 70s and the 80s. Many of the songs, even today, that are really loved in our fellowship are just sort of like grown-up choruses. They are choruses with some verses added in, and our congregations still respond very favorably to the singability of these worship declarations. There are some apostolic writers that are grabbing, again, sort of getting back in touch with the simplicity of these kind of songs. Writers like Charity Gale, Oneness Apostolic writers who are saying, man, people need simple worship so that they can easily enter into God's presence and not be encumbered by a big performance dynamic. Here's the third trend that I see. We were greatly shaped as a fellowship by the writing and the choir leading of Lanny Wolf. Now, I know that it may be difficult for us at times to talk about individuals who have fallen out of our fellowship or even fallen out of the apostolic movement. But if you're going to be a lover of history, I for one, I cannot skip over his historical contributions. You realize that Lanny Wolf has more songs than any other apostolic writer in Sing Unto the Lord. He's the most prolific apostolic writer that was documented in our hymn book. His National Music Ministry Convention, which was held in Jackson, Mississippi each year, literally defined the repertoires of choirs all across our fellowship. Now, most of Lanny's song choices for his personal trio, the Lanny Wolf Trio, were ones he had written. But his choir choices were not just about his own writing. He brought an incredible diversity of gospel artists into the ears of Oneness Pentecostal. Lanny was finding material from black churches all across the country and bringing them home to us, and we readily embraced them. He made the songs of Sandra Crouch, the Hawkins family, and so many other great gospel artists known to us. In fact, in a lot of ways, Lanny really defined that music as being church usable music. So many times people didn't even know who the original artist was. They just thought of it as a Jackson song or a National Music Ministry Convention song and never even really knew those original sources because Lanny so powerfully made those songs ours. This was really a reflection, this bringing in of gospel and his love for gospel music was a real reflection of his Columbus roots. You know, Columbus was incredibly integrated in the early Oneness Church environment. In those early days of Pentecostal outpouring, there were blacks and whites that worshiped alike, and it was a beautiful environment of integration. Man, that is something to be coveted for sure. And Lanny took that, his upbringing and the beautiful mixture of black and white, and brought it into the Oneness Apostolic Church. In the 80s and 90s, our music was shaped strongly by Jaron Davis. To name a few of his songs, Send It On Down, Holy Ground, Peace Speaker, those are still being sung weekly in Oneness Pentecostal services. Excuse me. Jaron's influence began during his years at Pentecostals of Alexandria. But even after Jaron's departure, POA and that church music program continued to strongly shape our fellowship. Because of their conference, because of the times and other big musical projects that church did, they have always been at the forefront of what we are doing as a fellowship and as a movement. People look to them for trend setting, whether they know it or not. As POA began to shift into a worshiping choir model under the influence of Mickey Mangan and Kevin Howard, rather than a more performance-driven choir, our movement also began to embrace this mixing of worship songs with choir repertoire, and we see that impact still today. The worship leading choir is a powerful concept that the choir doesn't just get up to perform or to entertain or to sing something that the congregation doesn't know, but the worshiping choir model says that the choir is just an extension of the worshiper in the pew, and that all together we can lift up songs that are worship in nature and intended to get the whole room singing. A fifth trend that I see is that current Oneness worship artists and churches are very much likely to be influenced by non-apostolic artists who are engaging the Spirit of God in their worship experiences. So we tend to be drawn to other people that we perceive as being Spirit-led and Spirit-filled. Although this list is not comprehensive, here's a few examples of people that we are actively seeking after. Artists like William McDowell, Israel Houghton in his more Jesus-centered days, Covenant Worship, Bethel, Carrie Job, and various teams that she's collaborated with. We are drawn to material that elevates the experience of the Holy Spirit in our gatherings. This really isn't much different than when we first began as a movement 75 years ago. The music that was popular then was the music that was written for gospel camp meetings and brush arbors. It didn't matter who was writing the music as long as they were part of a movement that was hungry for more of God. Today, we still love music that is revival-centric. We don't typically judge the source as much as we feel after the spirit or the revival motive of the song. We're drawn to people that seem to be equally as passionate and hungry for the Spirit and the outpouring of the Spirit as we perceive that we are as a fellowship. There has been some recent dialogue about the importance of theology in the artists that we choose to embrace. Recent concerns have been voiced actually about the theology of several popular worship groups that are often, whose songs are often replicated in our services. But in general, we are willing to embrace shared worship repertoire. Even in Sing Unto the Lord, in my looking at it in preparation for this class, I was surprised to find a song that to me felt a little theologically edgy. But it was a popular song, and it talked about the cross, and so apparently it was okay. And that's the song I Should Have Been Crucified by Gordon Jensen. Now, mind you, in the 70s when Sing Unto the Lord came out, that was a really popular worship, or a really popular song, like solo song to sing. And so it made its way into our hymn book. But if you really look at it, look at the phrase, Jesus, God's Son, took my place. I know for me, if I were filtering that song through today's lens, I'd probably stay away from that song because that feels like somewhat of a Trinitarian statement. Jesus, God's Son, took my place. I understand that, we do believe in all the roles that God took, but notice how something that could be a little theologically questioned made its way into our hymn book, and I think it reflects just the trend that in general we tend to go with the feel of the song and the emotion of it, and does it really seem to be a God-centered song and a song that pushes me closer to the cross? If so, then yeah, thumbs up, I'm going to embrace it. This tendency to overlook theological priorities in favor of a great song is an unfortunate tendency, but I do think it's an important trend for us to note. And maybe it's an important trend for us to respond to, and a trend that we should move away from. In recent years, there's been just this incredible emergence of quality apostolic writers and worship leaders who are interested in seeing apostolic music be more readily available. I think it's important for all of these emerging writers whom I support and admire and stand behind in every way. I think it's important that we remind them that as a fellowship, we have not lost our appetite for revival. And with it, we have an appetite for songs that facilitate seeking the presence of the Lord. That desire guided our forefathers out from the brush arbors and into the establishment of a denomination. And weekly, whether consciously or unconsciously, it guides the song choices of worship leaders all across our fellowship. Our people want music that is Spirit-centered, music that opens up the heart to the presence of God and draws the worshiper in. That's what we love. That's our trend. And I don't think that's a trend that's going away. We're a fellowship also that loves our apostolic tenets. We love the blood. We love the name. We love to talk about baptism in the name. We love the choice of sacrifice and being called out separate from the world. But these things are also loved by other writers and worshipers across the globe. So it's my prediction that we will continue to move forward in writing our own uniquely apostolic music while we continue to share much worship repertoire with Christendom at large. I hope you've heard something interesting today. 20 minutes is a very short opportunity to really dig deep into history, to really digest and talk about history. But I hope that in just this small conversation, you've been challenged to explore more about our wonderful legacy of apostolic worship music. And I hope you've been challenged to see it grow and nurtured in coming years. Let's support one another. Let's create a beautiful legacy together. Our behaviors today create history for tomorrow. So let's write, let's produce. Most of all, let's just guard the tenets of our faith. Let's guard the experience of the Spirit. Let's guard the power of the blood and the name, and always allow those things to flourish in what we're doing musically. May God bless you. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you today.